Refugee law training. Training for South African legal and paralegal practitioners to understand the basic principles of refugee status determinations for LGBTQIA+ asylum claimants. South Africa's domestic and international refugee protection obligations. South Africa is a signatory and has ratified without reservations both the 1951 UN Convention and the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. South Africa is also a signatory to the 1969 Organization for African Union (OAU) Convention governing specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. To give effect to these two conventions, the Refugees Act 130 of 1998 was promulgated, domesticating its international and regional obligations under those treaties. Refugee status determination is a crucial step for an asylum claimant to guarantee their protection and access to rights afforded to refugees. The Refugee Conventions and South African refugee protection laws define who is a refugee, and it is critical that in the implementation of both international and domestic law that a refugee must be identified. The non-refoulement principle. The principle of non-refoulement is an international law principle and has been referred to as the cornerstone of international refugee protection. The principle is considered a jus cogens norm, which means that this principle is a norm in international law and it cannot be set aside. This principle means that no person may be refused entry into South Africa, expelled, extradited, or returned to any other country if this would result in that person being subjected to persecution on account of his or her race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. This principle is also applicable to the frontiers or borders of a country, and South Africa cannot prohibit entry at their borders if that prohibition would amount to refoulement. Refoulement is done through deportation and extradition. What is refugee status determination? A person is a refugee as soon as they fulfill the criteria contained in the definition of a refugee under international and domestic law. This would necessarily occur prior to the time at which their refugee status is formally determined. Recognition of their refugee status does not therefore make them a refugee but declares them to be one. Refugee status determinations are an examination by a government authority, in this case the Department of Home Affairs, of whether a claimant who has submitted an asylum application or expressed a need to seek international protection is a refugee. Who is a refugee? The 1951 Convention provides the basis for determining who is a refugee and provides that a person is a refugee the moment they fulfill the criteria set out in the definition. This has often been referred to as the eligibility criteria. The criteria are divided into three parts. The inclusion clauses, which define the criteria that a person must satisfy before they are declared a refugee. The exclusion clauses, which list circumstances in which a person may be excluded, and the cessation clauses, which indicate the conditions under which a refugee ceases to be a refugee. Eligibility criteria. LGBTQIA+ refugee status determinations. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and/or gender identity has been held to be prohibited by international human rights law. Respect for fundamental human rights and the principle of non-discrimination are core features of the 1951 Convention and international refugee law, and the refugee definition should be interpreted with regard to the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and/or gender identity. South African law specifically prohibits discrimination on the ground of sexual orientation and/or gender. Inclusion criteria. Burden and standard of proof. The burden of proof generally lies with the claimant, but in some cases where the claimant may not be able to provide documentary or other proof to corroborate their claims, this duty is shared between the claimant and the decision maker. Where a claimant is not in a position to prove every part of their claim, but their story is coherent, plausible, and credible, the benefit of the doubt should be given to the claimant. Asylum claimants are not required to prove their fear beyond a reasonable doubt or that it would be more probable than not that their fear might materialize. The acceptable standard of proof is a reasonable possibility that the claimant would face some form of harm if they were to return to their country of origin. Elements of the 1951 Convention Refugee Definition. There are 4 elements within the refugee definition that needs to be satisfied to meet the inclusion criteria. The claimant is outside the country of origin or habitual place of residence. The claimant has a well-founded fear of persecution. The harm feared amounts to persecution. The claimant fears persecution based on a convention ground that is on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. Outside the country of nationality or habitual residence. A person can only be a refugee once they are outside their country of nationality or habitual residence. This is a factual analysis based on documents, statements, or facts presented by the claimant. Well-founded fear. The term well-founded fear contains a subjective and an objective element. The claimant's story or account, their personal experiences, personal and family background, and the way they interpreted the events that led to their flight from their country may be sufficient to establish a subjective fear of persecution. In some instances, the fact that they have applied for asylum is enough to establish a fear of returning to their country of nationality or habitual residence. The refugee definition, however, qualifies this subjective fear in that the subjective fear should be well-founded. Whether the fear is well-founded must be assessed in the context of the situation in the claimant's country of origin and the claimant's personal circumstances. The claimant's credibility must be evaluated against the objective information on the conditions in the country of origin. Persecution. The claimant's well-founded fear must relate to persecution. Persecution means a threat to life or physical freedom, serious human rights violations, or systematic or repetitive forms of less serious harms that may have adverse consequences for the claimant. Generally, to be eligible for refugee protection, the claimant must prove current or future fear of persecution. Discrimination remains one of the most common experiences of LGBTQIA+ persons. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and/or gender identity will amount to persecution where the measures of discrimination would lead to consequences of a substantially prejudicial nature for a refugee claimant. If the claimant suffered persecution in the past, it may normally be assumed that they continue to be at risk of persecution. A person may still qualify for asylum if they are avoiding persecution in the future.LGBTQIA+ claimants may not have experienced persecution in the past, and the well-foundedness of a claimant's fear of persecution would be determined by what they might face if they returned to their country. The claimant need not prove that the state authorities knew about their sexual orientation and/or gender identity before they left their country. A LGBTQIA+ claimant concealing or being discreet about their sexual orientation and/or gender identity to avoid persecution is not a valid reason to deny refugee status. Threshold of persecution. Not every violation of a claimant's human rights or discrimination would amount to persecution. Serious violations of non-derogable human rights, such as the right to life, would generally amount to persecution, whilst serious or less serious violations cumulatively of other rights, such as socio-economic rights, may amount to persecution. There are common instances where discrimination of LGBTQIA+ claimants amount to persecution. Threats of serious abuse and violence. Physical, psychological, and sexual violence including rape. Corrective rape is common among LGBTQIA+ claimants. Measures taken to change a claimant's sexual orientation and/or gender identity by force or coercion, such as forced institutionalization, forced sex reassignment surgery, forced electroshock therapy, and forced drug injection or hormone therapy, non-consensual medical and scientific experimentation. Detention solely based on sexual orientation and/or gender identity, including in psychological or medical institutions. Forced or underage marriage, forced pregnancy and/or marital rape, and other forms of corrective measures used as a means of denial or correcting nonconformity may all rise to the level of persecution. Restrictions on the full enjoyment of other human rights, such as rights to inheritance, custody and visitation rights for children, pension rights, freedom of expression, association and assembly, and access to socio-economic rights such as housing, education, and healthcare. Discrimination in access to and retention of employment. Persecution versus prosecution. Where the claimant is fleeing legitimate prosecution, they would not be entitled to international protection as a refugee. A refugee is a victim or potential victim of injustice, not a fugitive from justice. There are two ways where prosecution can amount to persecution: where the law or policy may itself be inherently persecutory, and where the implementation of the law or policy is carried out in a manner that amounts to persecution. Agents of persecution. State persecution may be present through the criminalization of same-sex relationships and enforcement of such laws. Agents of persecution are not limited to the state itself or its agencies. Persecution can be at the hands of non-state actors, such as non-governmental entities, irregular forces who have de facto authority over a national territory, the local populace, or family members. Where serious discriminatory or other offensive acts are committed by the local populace, they can be considered as persecution if they are knowingly tolerated by the state authorities or if there's an absence or unwillingness of state protection. Convention grounds. The refugee definition under the 1951 Convention requires that a claimant's well-founded fear of persecution must be based on one or more of the grounds listed. This has been referred to as the causal link requirement. The convention ground should be a contributing factor to the well-founded fear of persecution, but need not be the sole or dominant cause. The causal link is also established where the authorities mistakenly impute a particular belief or attribute a characteristic to an individual. For example, where the authorities mistakenly believe that the claimant is gay. The most common ground of persecution for LGBTQIA+ claimants is membership in a particular social group. This does not mean that LGBTQIA+ claimants do not or could not fear persecution on any one or more of the other grounds listed in the 1951 Convention or the South African Refugees Act. Membership in a particular social group. A particular social group is defined as a group of persons who share a common characteristic other than their risk of persecution or who are perceived as a group by society. The characteristics will often be one which is innate, unchangeable, or which is otherwise fundamental to identity, conscience, or the exercise of one's human rights. There are two approaches in determining a particular social group: protected characteristics or social perception. The first protected characteristics approach involves determining whether the group is united either by an innate or immutable characteristic or by a characteristic that is so fundamental to human dignity that a person should not be compelled to forsake it. Sexual orientation and/or gender identity are considered innate and immutable characteristics or are characteristics that are fundamental to human dignity such that a LGBTQIA+ claimant should not be forced to abandon them. The second social perception approach examines whether the particular group shares common characteristics which makes it recognizable or differentiates them from society at large. The characteristics of a person whose sexuality or gender identity is still evolving should be considered as fundamental to their evolving identity, which would bring them within the social group ground. There is no requirement that members of the social group associate with one another or that they are socially visible. Decision makers should avoid reliance on stereotypes or assumptions. Not all LGBTQIA+ persons look or behave according to stereotypical concepts. Internal flight or relocation alternative. Where the claimant's fear of persecution is confined to a certain part of the country, an assessment of whether they could reasonably be expected to move to another part of the country where they could avail themselves of state protection is required. A determination of whether the internal flight or relocation is an option requires a two-step analysis. The relevance analysis. This involves an examination of whether the area of relocation is practically, safely, and legally accessible to the claimant and whether the claimant would face persecution on the same or new grounds in the new location from state or non-state actors. The reasonableness analysis. Where internal flight or relocation is relevant, the next step would be to determine whether the claimant could reasonably be expected to establish themselves and live a normal life without undue hardships. Internal flight or relocation option may not be relevant or reasonable where there is general intolerance of LGBTQIA+ persons countrywide and a claimant would have to continue concealing their sexual orientation or gender identity to be safe. This training video was developed by the Legal Resources Center and funded by the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Pretoria, South Africa.